George Strait has often reflected on his career with characteristic understatement. "I've had a great career," he once admitted, adding quietly that if there were one thing he might change, it would be continuing to write music during the years he stepped away from it. He described a long period of creative silence, not marked by bitterness or regret, but by a loss of inspiration and a gradual drift away from the discipline of writing. That modest confession, spoken without drama, offers an unusually revealing entry point into the life of one of American music's most carefully guarded figures. For more than 3 decades, George Strait maintained an image of steadiness, tradition, and emotional restraint that few ever questioned. Yet behind the spotless public persona of country music's most respected legend, another life was unfolding quietly, one shaped by grief, devotion, discipline, and deliberate silence. Even those closest to him were often unaware of the depth of what he carried beyond the spotlight. Only now, as time has softened the distance between public myth and private truth, is that fuller story beginning to emerge, reshaping what audiences thought they knew about the man known as the King of Country. Born George Harvey Strait on May 18, 1952, in the small town of Poteet, Texas, Strait's early life bore none of the markers of celebrity. He was raised primarily in nearby Pistol, where his family owned and worked a cattle farm. The rhythms of rural life shaped him early, instilling habits of responsibility, endurance, and humility that would later become inseparable from both his personality and his music. Farm life was demanding and often unforgiving. Long hours, physical labor, and the expectation that everyone contribute were simply facts of daily existence. There was little room for indulgence, and even less for self-pity. These formative experiences taught Strait that commitment was not something spoken, but something lived. When his parents divorced during his childhood, George and his brother were raised by their father, a junior high school mathematics teacher who balanced academic discipline with the realities of farm work. The dual influence of structure and labor created a foundation of perseverance that followed Strait into adulthood. Education mattered, but so did showing up, finishing what you started, and carrying your share of the weight. Those values would later distinguish Strait in an industry often characterized by volatility and excess. Music entered his life gradually rather than dramatically. As a teenager in the late 1960s, Strait gravitated toward traditional country music, particularly the work of Hank Williams, Merle Haggard, and George Jones. While many of his peers chased contemporary trends, Strait found solace in classic melodies and plain-spoken lyrics that reflected real lives and ordinary struggles. In high school, he briefly played in a rock-and-roll garage band, but the experience only confirmed what he already sensed. His artistic instincts belonged firmly within the emotional honesty and narrative simplicity of country music. After graduating from Pistol High School, Strait enrolled in college, but his studies were soon interrupted by service in the United States Army during the early 1970s. Stationed in Hawaii, he joined an Army-sponsored country band called Ramblin' Country, performing for fellow servicemen and local audiences. These performances marked his first sustained experience on stage and quietly confirmed that music was more than a passing interest. When he returned to Texas later in the decade and resumed college, Strait carried with him not only sharpened musical instincts, but a maturity forged by discipline, distance from home, and responsibility. In December 1971, at just 19 years old, George Strait married his high school sweetheart, Norma Voss. Their marriage, formed long before fame entered the picture, would become the emotional backbone of his life. Unlike many public figures whose relationships are shaped under the pressures of celebrity, George and Norma built their partnership in obscurity, rooted in shared history, trust, and mutual respect. Their bond was quiet, steadfast, and remarkably durable. In 1972, the couple welcomed their first child, a daughter named Jennifer. Fatherhood arrived early, forcing Strait to mature quickly while still searching for his professional identity. During these years, he balanced young family responsibilities with military service and uncertain career prospects, often choosing stability over ambition. These were not glamorous years, but they were formative ones. Family was never an accessory to success, it was the foundation upon which everything else rested. As Strait pursued music more seriously in the late 1970s, the demands on his time increased. Long drives, small venues, and modest pay defined daily life. Norma remained a steady presence, offering support without seeking attention. She avoided the spotlight entirely, preferring privacy to recognition, and George respected that boundary throughout his career. In an industry known for instability, their marriage became a rare constant. In 1981, the couple welcomed their son, George "Bubba" Strait Jr., just as George's career began to gain momentum. Despite growing fame, Strait drew a clear line between professional success and personal life. He chose home over nightlife, loyalty over excess, and consistency over spectacle. This commitment grounded him personally and shaped the emotional restraint that would later define both his music and public image. That carefully constructed balance was shattered on June 25, 1986. On that day, in San Marcos, Texas, George and Norma's 13-year-old daughter Jennifer was killed in a catastrophic car accident. Riding in a Ford Mustang driven by a friend, Jennifer was partially ejected when the vehicle lost control and rolled. Investigators later confirmed that none of the occupants were wearing seat belts. Jennifer died instantly. For the Strait family, the loss was incomprehensible. Jennifer had been the couple's first child and the quiet center of their family life. Her death tore away a foundational certainty that had anchored George long before fame arrived. Those closest to the family described a period of profound withdrawal as the Straits retreated inward to mourn privately. Unlike many public figures, George made a deliberate decision to shield his grief from public view. He largely stopped giving interviews, avoided personal questions, and distanced himself from the media. His silence was not detachment, but survival. Music remained his outlet, but even there he avoided direct confession. Emotion surfaced subtly, through tone and restraint rather than explicit narrative. This approach became a defining characteristic of his artistry. Fame, awards, and commercial success faded in importance compared to preserving what remained of his family. In 1987, George and Norma transformed grief into purpose by co-founding the Jennifer Lynn Strait Foundation, quietly supporting children's charities without public spectacle. The foundation became a living tribute, ensuring that Jennifer's name would be associated not with tragedy, but with compassion. Over the years, the foundation has donated millions of dollars to children's causes, operating largely outside the spotlight. It offered no closure, such a loss allows none, but it provided a means of channeling sorrow into service. In April 2009, Strait faced another loss with the death of his older brother, John Byron "Buddy" Strait, at age 58. Buddy had shared George's rural upbringing and witnessed his life long before fame. Losing him meant losing one of the last living links to his earliest self. As with previous losses, Strait grieved privately, reinforcing his belief that grief does not require an audience to be real. Following Jennifer's death, Strait's decision to prioritize privacy reshaped his career. At a time when the industry demanded access and exposure, he withdrew. He declined talk shows, limited interviews, and let his music speak in place of confession. Concerts became his primary connection with audiences. Over time, this restraint evolved into mystique, earning him respect as an artist who valued authenticity over spectacle. In 2024, Strait entered another reflective chapter. That September marked the release of Cowboys and Dreamers, an album shaped by maturity and loss. During its completion, Strait lost three men central to his life on the road: longtime fiddle player Gene Elders and manager Irv Woolsey on March 20, followed by road manager Tom Foote on April 29. These were not merely professional colleagues, but trusted companions whose presence had defined decades of touring. The album was dedicated to their memory, honoring them quietly, as Strait has always done. In April 2025, he suffered another blow with the death of his longtime friend, rodeo legend Roy "Super Looper" Cooper, who died in a house fire. Their friendship spanned more than 4 decades, rooted in shared values of humility, discipline, and respect for tradition. At Cooper's funeral, Strait delivered a rare public tribute, his voice reportedly trembling as he spoke. It was an uncommon moment of vulnerability that revealed the depth of a bond forged far beyond fame. Through loss after loss, George Strait has remained consistent in his response: gratitude over bitterness, privacy over performance, dignity over display. His legacy is not defined solely by record sales or sold-out arenas, but by a life lived with restraint, loyalty, and quiet resolve. In choosing what not to share, Strait redefined what strength looks like in public life. His story reminds us that sometimes the most enduring truths are carried not in words, but in silence, and that behind even the most spotless legends are lives shaped by devotion, grief, and an unwavering commitment to what truly matters. George Strait's enduring influence cannot be understood solely through biography or personal tragedy. It must also be examined through the deliberate artistic and ethical choices that shaped his career, particularly his complicated relationship with songwriting, authorship, and visibility. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Strait rarely positioned himself as a confessional artist. His regret over stepping away from writing music for long stretches of time reveals not insecurity, but a deeply ingrained humility, one that ultimately defined how he understood his role in country music. He never sought to dominate the narrative. Instead, he became its most faithful steward. Strait's approach to songwriting stands in contrast to the dominant myth of the singer-songwriter as the primary vessel of authenticity. While he did write early in his career and intermittently later, he increasingly relied on outside writers whose work aligned with his moral and emotional compass. This decision was often misunderstood as artistic distance. In reality, it reflected an older country tradition in which interpretation mattered as much as authorship. Strait understood that truth in music does not depend on who writes the words, but on whether the performer honors them. His restraint became a form of integrity. This interpretive discipline allowed Strait to function less as a narrator of his own life and more as a conduit for collective experience. His songs rarely named specific events or individuals, yet they resonated because they carried emotional precision without exposure. Love, regret, loyalty, loss, and endurance were expressed without spectacle. In this way, Strait's music mirrored his life philosophy: feel deeply, but speak sparingly. The commercial success that followed was extraordinary. Over the course of his career, Strait amassed more #1 hits than any artist in the history of country music. Yet he never used this dominance to reshape himself into a celebrity personality. While peers embraced reinvention, controversy, or crossover appeal, Strait remained steadfastly traditional. He resisted pop trends, avoided political posturing, and declined to transform his image to suit changing markets. This consistency was not stagnation, it was discipline. In an industry increasingly driven by visibility, Strait's refusal to perform intimacy became radical. Media scholars often describe modern celebrity as a contract of access. Audiences expect emotional transparency in exchange for admiration. Strait quietly rejected that contract. His life demonstrates that fame does not require confession, and that dignity can function as its own form of narrative authority. Rather than inviting audiences into his private grief, he asked them to meet him where he stood, on stage, in song, and nowhere else. This philosophy extended into his construction of masculinity. Country music has long trafficked in exaggerated performances of male identity, outlaw bravado, emotional volatility, or performative toughness. Strait offered an alternative model. His masculinity was grounded in reliability rather than dominance, endurance rather than excess. He sang about commitment without sentimentality, heartbreak without spectacle, and faithfulness without moralizing. In doing so, he expanded the emotional vocabulary available to men in country music without rejecting tradition. His marriage to Norma Strait remains one of the most stable relationships in popular music history, not because it was free of hardship, but because it was shielded from consumption. Strait never transformed his marriage into mythology. He simply lived it. This refusal to monetize intimacy further distinguished him from peers and reinforced the boundaries he placed around his family life. Bubba Strait's upbringing outside celebrity culture stands as evidence that this boundary was not symbolic, but rigorously enforced. Critically, Strait's legacy is inseparable from loss, but it is not defined by it. The death of his daughter Jennifer shaped his silence, but it did not harden him. Instead, it deepened his sense of proportion. Success became contextual, not central. Awards were accepted graciously, but never pursued publicly. Tours were carefully structured to minimize intrusion into family life. Even his so-called retirement from touring in 2012 was framed not as withdrawal, but as recalibration. He continued to perform selectively, on his own terms. Academically, Strait's career invites reconsideration of authorship, authenticity, and celebrity ethics. He challenges the assumption that emotional transparency is a prerequisite for artistic legitimacy. His work suggests an alternative framework, authenticity as alignment between values, behavior, and output. In this model, silence is not absence, but intention. Privacy is not evasion, but responsibility. The deaths of longtime collaborators in 2024 further underscore the communal nature of Strait's success. Unlike narratives that elevate the lone genius, Strait's story emphasizes continuity, loyalty, and shared labor. His tributes were understated because his gratitude had never required performance. Cowboys and Dreamers functions not as a farewell album, but as a meditation on endurance, on carrying forward when the people who once made the road familiar are gone. Roy Cooper's death in 2025 briefly disrupted Strait's lifelong reserve, revealing how deeply friendship, not fame, defined his emotional world. That public eulogy was powerful precisely because it was rare. It confirmed what listeners had long sensed: behind the calm exterior was not emotional absence, but emotional discipline. Strait did not feel less, he simply chose when, and whether, to speak. As George Strait moves deeper into legacy status, his significance only sharpens. In an era dominated by oversharing, reinvention, and algorithmic intimacy, his career stands as a counterargument. He proves that longevity does not require constant visibility, that tradition can coexist with relevance, and that silence, when chosen with care, can be as expressive as song. Ultimately, George Strait's life and work reveal a truth that resists easy summary: greatness is not always loud. Sometimes it is steady. Sometimes it is private. And sometimes it is defined not by what a man reveals to the world, but by what he protects from it. George Strait's legacy ultimately resides not only in his unparalleled commercial success, but in the ethical framework through which that success was achieved. In a cultural landscape that increasingly equates visibility with value, Strait's career stands as a sustained argument for restraint. His refusal to convert personal pain into public currency challenges dominant models of celebrity and invites a re-evaluation of what authenticity truly means within popular culture. Strait's significance lies in his consistency. Across decades of industry change, shifting musical trends, and personal loss, he remained anchored to a set of principles shaped long before fame: loyalty to family, respect for tradition, and a belief that meaning is preserved through discipline rather than exposure. These values were not marketed as virtues, they were practiced quietly. In this way, Strait redefined success not as reinvention, but as continuity. From an academic perspective, Strait complicates prevailing theories of authorship and emotional labor in music. He demonstrates that interpretive authority can coexist with personal privacy, and that emotional resonance does not require autobiographical disclosure. His songs resonate precisely because they are not overt confessions. Instead, they operate within a shared emotional grammar, allowing listeners to locate their own experiences within the music rather than consuming the artist's pain as spectacle. Equally important is Strait's contribution to constructions of masculinity in country music. His public identity resists extremes. He neither performs emotional detachment nor indulges in performative vulnerability. Instead, he models a masculinity grounded in reliability, commitment, and quiet endurance. In doing so, he expands the emotional possibilities available to male artists without rejecting tradition, offering an alternative to both hypermasculine bravado and commodified sensitivity. As George Strait moves further into cultural memory, his relevance endures precisely because he never chased relevance. His career suggests that longevity is not sustained through constant visibility, but through trust that audiences will recognize sincerity even when it is understated. In an era of relentless self-disclosure, Strait's silence becomes his most radical statement. Ultimately, George Strait's life and work affirm that greatness need not be loud to be lasting. It can be measured instead by steadiness, by the protection of what matters most, and by the quiet integrity of a man who understood that some truths are most powerful when left unspoken.